It's November 30th, 1908, in Lancaster, South Carolina. Inside the cotton mill, the air is white with dust, and the spinning frames run so loud you can feel them in your teeth. A girl stands at a machine that towers over her. She is exactly 4 feet tall. We know that because it's written on the photograph. A man in a suit is here with a camera, and in 1908, cameras are not welcome inside cotton mills. As he opens the shutter, she looks straight down the lens. Then he writes what he can. 48 inches high, has worked half a year, no age. But he writes her name. That picture became one of the most famous photographs of child labor ever taken. It's in the Library of Congress right now. And the name on it is wrong. This is a history of the man with the hidden camera. To understand how that photograph exists and why the name on it is wrong, you need the man behind the camera. And here's the first surprise. He wasn't really a photographer. He was a school teacher. Lewis Hine taught in New York City. Around 1904, he started bringing his students to Ellis Island, photographing the immigrant families coming ashore. And somewhere in those crowds, he worked out something that seems obvious now and wasn't then. A photograph could be an argument. In 1908, he quit teaching. A reform group, the National Child Labor Committee, hired him to photograph working children. Because their problem wasn't that nobody knew children worked in mills and mines. Everybody knew. Their problem was that nobody had to look. The work happened behind factory doors, and it was kept there on purpose. So here's the question. How do you photograph something an entire country has agreed not to see? You lie your way in. Mills didn't want cameras inside. He was not welcome in these places, and he knew it. So he became other people. Some days a Bible salesman, some days a postcard salesman, some days an industrial photographer, there to document the machines. Please pay no attention to the children running them. Suit and tie, gentleman head to toe, acting his way through the front gate. And when the act failed, he didn't leave. He stood outside the gate at shift change and photographed the children walking out. He had a name for all this, not art, not journalism. He called it detective work. And like a detective, he kept notes. He'd trained in stenography, professional speed writing, and his captions record everything. Names, wages, hours, ages when he could get them. But ages could be lied about, and often were. So he also recorded something no one could lie about. Height. Why go to all that trouble? Because of something a mill overseer in Chester, South Carolina told him to his face, openly, like it was nothing. Here's how mills all over the South got around the child labor law. They let young children come in to help an older brother or sister. The little one's name never went on the company's books. The pay went to the older child. On paper, the small child at the spinning frame did not exist. And a child who doesn't exist on paper can't be counted. And a child who can't be counted can't be protected. So that's what Lewis Hine was actually doing, mill by mill. He wasn't taking pictures. He was making children exist on paper. In November 1908, Hine went south. A 3-month tour of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. What he found was worse than the rumors. Textile mills running on children of 7, 8, 9, 10. Canneries packing seafood with workers as young as 4. Then he reached Lancaster, South Carolina, and somehow he got inside the Lancaster cotton mills. The record doesn't say how. What survives is what he did there, because every photograph got a number and a caption. Number 337. A boy named John Gent, spinning for a year already. Caption. Goes to school now, been sick. The mill itself. One of the worst places I have found for child labor. And number 362. The girl at the spinning frame, 48 inches. But it's numbers 339 and 340 that show you how this man's mind worked. One is the school where the mill children go, a small shed-like building. The other is the public school, the solid one. 2 consecutive negatives, 339 and 340, made on the same trip, and his captions do all the work. This is where the mill children go to school. This is where the other children go to school. He wasn't collecting evidence anymore. He was building an argument, one frame at a time. He shot the comparison in the field before anyone could edit it into existence. And the first caption keeps going. Enrollment, 163. Attendance, about 100. From a mill with more than 1,000 workers. And the mill village itself? Geographically part of Lancaster, but on account of the taxes, kept just out of the corporate limits. The town line was drawn around those families on purpose. Remember that. It matters in the next video. Now, you might be wondering, wasn't any of this illegal? South Carolina had a child labor law. The age limit was 12, but the exceptions were written right into it. Orphans? Allowed to work at any age. Children of parents who depended on their wages? Any age. Any child who'd done 4 months of school that year and could read and write? Free to work the whole summer. Any age. In the very mill where Hine photographed Sadie, an investigator had examined 45 children and found 34 couldn't read. One girl of 7 had been working for a year and a half. Do the math. She started at 5.5. And it broke no law at all. She was an orphan. And across the state line in North Carolina? To convict an employer, you had to prove he broke the law knowingly and willfully. The state's labor commissioner had no authority to even enter a factory, and the Reform Committee's own summary of that law ends with a single line: no prosecutions under the law. The law wasn't failing to stop child labor. The law was how child labor was done. That's why the ruler. In January 1909, weeks after he photographed Sadie, the reformer Florence Kelley put Lewis Hine's whole method into 2 sentences. The camera is convincing. Where records fail and parents forswear themselves, the measuring rod and the camera carry conviction. The records were lies. So, a ruler and a lens. Hine made more than 5,000 of these photographs. And for almost a century, that's what they stayed. Photographs. Faces without endings. Then, in 2005, a novelist asked a friend of hers over to dinner. A retired social worker living in Massachusetts named Jo Manning. She had been writing about a Vermont mill girl in one of Hine's pictures, and she wanted to know what happened to the real one. Could he find out? It took him about 2 weeks to reach a living relative, the girl's granddaughter, who had never seen the photograph. Inside 3 months, he had the rest of the family. And Manning realized, if it worked for one child in the photographs, it could work for others. He called it the Lewis Hine Project. Census records, obituaries, cemetery listings, giving the faces their endings back. Sadie was one of the hardest. Manning searched for her descendants and found nothing. No grandchildren. Nobody carrying her story. So in 2013, he tried the direct approach. He asked a newspaper in the county where she died to print the famous photograph with an appeal. Does anyone know this girl? March 31st, 2013. The photograph runs. Nobody answers. More than a century after a man in a suit wrote her name in a mill in Lancaster, nobody was looking for Sadie. So Manning tried one more thing. He typed the name of Sadie's older sister into a search engine. Connie. And a chain unspooled. A grave listing for a woman who died in 1975, whose mother was listed as Connie. That led to a 2001 obituary. Connie's son, Sadie's nephew. And at the bottom of it, in the list of survivors, a daughter living in North Carolina. Manning found her phone number and called, and asked about Sadie. And she said, "Yes, Sadie was my grandaunt. My father grew up in her house. He told me stories about her." He sent her the photograph, and on July 12, 2013, they talked about Sadie. More than a century on, someone from Sadie's own family looking at the girl at the spinning frame. So here is what the family and the records tell us. School to the 2nd grade, then the mill. Married at about 17 to a man named Arthur Bush, and then a whole life of cotton mills. Danville, Rock Hill, Gastonia, Bessemer City, town to town, mill to mill, for the rest of her working life. Her family remembered that she talked slow and moved slow. A lifetime in the mills does that. Sadie died of a stroke in 1950. She was 51. And one detail from her obituary, the kind Hine would have caught. Her only son isn't listed among the survivors. He seems to have died before she did. So there may be no descendants at all. No grandchildren, no line. Everything that's left of her is a name, a face at a spinning frame, and a grandniece who remembered the stories. Oh, and about that name. When her photograph was published in 1909, the caption read, "One of many small children." The public never got her name at all. The committee's files got one, spelled wrong. Hine recorded Phifer. The family spelled it Phifer. And to this day, the great museums that hang this photograph can't agree. One archive says Phifer, another says Phifer. The family said Phifer. The public got no name. The files got the wrong ones. And the right one took 105 years. You'd like to think the photographs fixed everything. The truth is slower and stranger. 1916. Congress passes a national child labor law. 2 years later, the Supreme Court strikes it down, 5-4. 1919. Congress tries again, as a tax. Struck down, 8-1. So in 1924, Congress goes all the way. A constitutional amendment. It needs 36 states. It gets 28. And stops. Congress never set a deadline, so the amendment never died. When the question reached the Supreme Court in 1939, the court refused to declare it dead. That call, it said, belongs to Congress. And Congress has never made it. The constitutional amendment to end child labor in America is still out there, still waiting on the states, more than 100 years later. 1933 brought a preview of winning. New Deal industry codes abolished child labor in the cotton mills, Sadie's industry. President Roosevelt put it in writing. This ancient atrocity went out in a day. 2 years later, the Supreme Court struck down the whole program, codes, protections, and all. Then, 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act. You'll hear that it ended child labor in America. It didn't. By the Labor Department's own history, it reached about 1/5 of the workforce, and it exempted farm work, an exemption that largely still exists. But it was federal, and it was law. And soon enough, a challenge to it was on its way to the Supreme Court. And Lewis Hine? The work dried up. He asked again and again to join the government's Big Depression photography project, turned down every time. In 1939, a photographer and an art critic, both a generation younger, hung a traveling retrospective of his life's work in a New York museum. And in those same last years, he lost his house and applied for public relief. Being remembered didn't pay him. On November 3, 1940, after an operation, Lewis Hine died. He was 66. 3 months later, February 3, 1941, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the Fair Labor Standards Act stood. And in the same decision, it reached back and overturned the 1918 ruling that had started the whole 23-year fight. The children won. 3 months after the man with the camera stopped being able to hear it. The year Hine died, Sadie was still working in a cotton mill. Her family says she worked in one for the rest of her life. But on a November morning in 1908, a man walked into her mill with a hidden purpose and a heavy camera, and wrote down what he could. 48 inches, half a year, and a name, spelled wrong. It turned out to be just enough. Next time, remember that mill village kept just outside the town line? There was a town where the boss owned everything. Your house, your church, your water, the store that sold your dinner. And the rent came out of your pay before you ever touched it. The town the boss owned. Subscribe so you don't miss it.